They could make an entire theater fall silent with one look. They could turn a joke into a national catchphrase. They could stare down a camera and convince millions of strangers they were loved. But inside their own houses? Some of Hollywood's most legendary names couldn't manage the one role that mattered most, being there. Not villains, exactly. Not always cruel. Just absent when it counted. This isn't gossip. It's documented: wills, memoirs, custody records, their own children's words. Stick around, because by the end of this list, you'll never watch their old movies the same way again. Number 1, Groucho Marx and Jackie Gleason, the ones who ran toward the spotlight and away from home. Let's start with two men whose names still make people laugh almost a century later: Groucho Marx and Jackie Gleason. Both built entire careers on being the loudest, funniest man in the room. Both left their own children searching for a version of them that never quite showed up at home. Groucho could dismantle an opponent with a single line, charm a live audience without even trying. But according to his son Arthur, that same razor wit became something else behind closed doors: a wall. Every serious moment got deflected into a joke. Every request for comfort got answered with sarcasm instead of warmth. Groucho wasn't cold, exactly. He wrote affectionate letters, he showed pride in his kids' successes. But when a child needed him to simply be serious for 5 minutes, humor became the escape hatch. And his children learned to stop expecting the door to open. Jackie Gleason took a different route to the same destination. Television audiences knew him as the Great One, a man so big on screen that whole living rooms belonged to him. His daughters Geraldine and Linda knew a different man, one who mostly lived somewhere else. As his fame grew and his nightlife expanded, Gleason spent longer and longer stretches away from the family home. Geraldine later called him, essentially, an absentee father, someone whose visits were rare enough to feel like events instead of normal life. And here's the cruel irony: the same man who built weekly television families that fought, made up, and stayed loyally together couldn't offer his real daughters that same consistency. Grand entrances, expensive gifts, big laughs, sure. But no one who remembered the small, boring, everyday details that make a child feel secure. Two entertainers. Two completely different public personas. The exact same private pattern: a father who could fill a room with love from a stage. Number 2, Laurence Olivier, the father who wrote down his own shame. Absence is one kind of wound. Laurence Olivier's son endured something arguably worse: a father who put his disappointment in writing. Tarquin Olivier was born during his father's marriage to actress Jill Esmond. When that marriage ended and Vivian Leigh consumed Olivier's emotional world, father and son drifted into a separation that reportedly stretched to roughly 17 years without seeing one another. Olivier was, by any measure, one of the greatest stage actors of the century: disciplined, commanding, relentlessly ambitious. Those same traits, so effective under stage lights, curdled into something colder at home. Tarquin, by his father's own account, didn't live up to the heroic image Olivier valued. And Olivier apparently couldn't hide his disappointment. He reportedly described feeling embarrassed by his own son in his own writing. Think about what that means. Tarquin wasn't losing a competition to another child. He was losing to an ideal, to strength, achievement, theatrical greatness that no real boy growing up could possibly embody. Here's the twist that makes this story sting even more: Tarquin's own memoir, written decades later, wasn't bitter. He described admiration. He described longing. He described the strange, aching confusion of loving a man who rarely made him feel like he was enough. That generosity toward his father doesn't erase what was written, it just makes the whole thing more human, and more tragic. Olivier could find the buried emotional truth inside Shakespeare's most complicated characters, night after night, in front of thousands of strangers. At home, with his own son, that same skill seemed to abandon him completely. He never figured out how to say the one uncomplicated sentence a boy needed to hear. And if you think that's the most painful father-child relationship on this list, wait, because we're about to cross an entire family dynasty where the exact Number 3, John Barrymore and John Drew Barrymore, a dynasty built on talent and broken by the same mistake, twice. The Barrymores gave Hollywood some of its greatest performers. They also gave 2 consecutive generations of children the same devastating inheritance, a famous surname, and a father who wasn't really there. Start with Diana Barrymore, daughter of the legendary John Barrymore. By the time Diana was old enough to understand who her father was, she knew him first as a legend, through posters, tabloid headlines, and whispered scandal, long before she knew him as an actual person. Her parents' marriage had already collapsed, and she spent her childhood shuffled between relatives and schools while adults tried to manage the chaos surrounding the Barrymore name. When she finally did get real time with her father, the man she met wasn't the dashing Shakespearean hero from the posters. He was aging, unstable, and unpredictable. John never explicitly rejected her. But to a child, absence can feel exactly like rejection, and that longing followed Diana into an adulthood spent struggling under a name that promised far more than it delivered. Now fast forward 1 generation. John Drew Barrymore, John's son, and the father of Drew Barrymore, inherited the exact same emotional gap his own father had left behind, and somehow managed to pass an even sharper version of it down the line. He moved unpredictably in and out of young Drew's life during the very years she was becoming a working child actress, attending adult industry events, and shouldering pressures no child should carry. Relatives described him as volatile during difficult stretches. Drew eventually put up distance to protect herself, though near the end of his life, she stepped back in to help arrange his care, reaching for a kind of peace that couldn't undo the earlier years. 2 generations. The same neglect, inherited and repeated instead of healed. Number 4. Ingrid Bergman. The scandal that crossed an ocean. Ingrid Bergman was, at the height of her American fame, essentially untouchable, until she made a decision the press would never let her forget. She left her husband, Peter Lindstrom, fell into a relationship with Italian director Roberto Rossellini, and in doing so, became separated from her young daughter, Pia. American newspapers treated it less like personal news and more like a trial. Bergman wasn't just an actress who'd broken Hollywood's carefully maintained moral image, she was a mother who had walked away from her child. Pia stayed behind in the United States while her mother built an entirely new life and family across the Atlantic. Custody battles and public hostility kept the two apart during years that mattered most in a child's development. Time did eventually soften things. Their relationship improved, and Bergman's children later defended her as complicated, warm, determined, not a woman who felt nothing for what she'd left behind. But here's the thing about a child's experience versus an adult's explanation: no amount of context erases an empty chair at the table. Bergman chased love and artistic freedom across an ocean. Pia was left trying to understand why her mother's new chapter seemed to matter more than the one she was already in. Hollywood, notably, forgave Bergman and welcomed her back to American film far sooner than Pia's own childhood ever came back to her. Now, if you think a public scandal is the worst way for a mother-daughter relationship to fracture, the next story involves something far quieter and, in some ways, far crueler: a mother who simply admitted, on camera, that she barely saw her own kids anymore. Number 5. Veronica Lake, the star who ran out of everything, including time with her children. By the late 1960s, Veronica Lake's life bore no resemblance to the polished mystery she'd built her career on. Her fame had faded. Her money was gone. She was living far from the studio system that once turned a single hairstyle into a national phenomenon. And in an interview from that period, she said something startlingly honest. She admitted she rarely saw her own children anymore. That's not a tabloid rumor or a biographer's interpretation, that's Lake, in her own words. Behind it sat a string of failed marriages and custody arrangements that steadily widened the distance between her and the family she'd once had. Career collapse and personal instability made rebuilding those bridges harder with every passing year. There's little evidence she felt hatred toward her kids. The more honest read is that she became disconnected while barely able to hold her own life together. But children don't experience a parent's decline as a sympathetic biography. They experience it as missed birthdays, uncertain visits, the quiet, corrosive belief that whatever crisis their parent was dealing with would always come first, before them. On screen, Lake played untouchable women hiding mysterious secrets under perfectly arranged hair. Off-screen, her real secret wasn't glamorous at all. By the time she was candid enough to explain herself publicly, much of her children's childhoods had already happened without her in the room. Up next, a mother whose health, not her choices, may have been quietly used against her, in a legal battle so bitter it didn't end until one of them had died. Number 6. Zsa Zsa Gabor, the mother, the daughter, and the man who stood between them. Few Hollywood families turn private conflict into full public theater quite like Zsa Zsa Gabor and her only child, Francesca Hilton. Francesca was the daughter of hotel magnate Conrad Hilton, but it was her relationship with her famous mother that eventually became the real story. As Gabor aged and her health declined, her husband, Frederick Prinz von Anhalt, took increasing control over who had access to her. And then came the moment that shocked even longtime Gabor watchers. Zsa Zsa herself joined a legal action accusing her own daughter of financial wrongdoing and mistreatment. Francesca denied every word of it. Here's what makes this story genuinely hard to judge, rather than just sad. Reports at the time suggested Francesca was sometimes physically prevented from visiting her own mother. Francesca claimed she was trying to protect Zsa Zsa. Von Anhalt painted her as a threat. So which was it? Was that lawsuit really an expression of what Gabor herself wanted? Or was a medically vulnerable elderly woman being steered by the person controlling her access to the outside world? Nobody ever got a clean answer. The public was left with competing narratives and no way to verify either one. What we do know for certain is heartbreaking in its simplicity. Francesca spent her final years fighting just to reach her own mother, and she died before Zsa Zsa did. The woman famous worldwide for calling every single person darling could never find a way to speak peacefully with her only daughter when it actually mattered. It's a story with no clear villain, just two women who, for reasons still debated, ran out of time to fix what had broken between them. Next up is a case even stranger. A woman who adopted a son, sent him away as a boy, and then, decades later, erased him from her final will entirely, even though he still called her mother. Number 7. Hedy Lamarr, the son erased from the will. Hedy Lamarr is remembered today as much for her scientific mind as her glamour. She co-invented technology that helped pave the way for modern wireless communication. But behind that legacy sits one of old Hollywood's strangest and most painful family disputes. During her marriage to screenwriter Jean Markey, Lamarr adopted a boy named James. Publicly, he was presented as her son, full stop, no asterisks, no qualifications. But the relationship eventually collapsed so completely that his place in her life was almost written out of history. Biographical accounts say James was sent away to boarding school around age 12. From there, he and Lamarr became estranged for decades, with essentially no relationship left to repair. Then Lamarr died, and James discovered he'd been completely excluded from her will. Not a small gesture, not an afterthought. A total erasure. To make it even more painful, questions surfaced afterward about the details of his adoption and his biological background, complicating an already devastating situation. James's argument was simple and understandable. Lamarr had raised him, presented him publicly, and treated him as her child for years, and he didn't think a parent gets to simply delete that history once the relationship becomes inconvenient. Meanwhile, Lamarr's other children remained firmly inside the recognized family circle. James was left standing outside it, effectively contesting the final version of his mother's own story. Maybe sending him away was framed, at the time, as ordinary discipline. Maybe silence just became easier than confronting what had actually happened between them. Either way, Lamarr helped invent technology that would shape the future, but she never found her way back to the boy who once called her mother. Number 8. Rita Hayworth, two sisters, two completely different childhoods, same famous mother. Under the red hair, the dazzling costumes, and that famous smile lived a woman whose daughters experienced something far less glamorous than the legend suggested. Rita Hayworth's private life was, by any measure, chaotic. 5 marriages, international custody conflicts, constant travel, personal struggles, and later an illness that went misunderstood for years before anyone had the right name for it, Alzheimer's disease. Her daughter Rebecca Wells, whose father was Orson Welles, spent chunks of her childhood in boarding schools and structured programs, away from home. Rebecca later made an observation that cuts right to the heart of it. The separations weren't just about filming schedules. They were about marriage after marriage, reshaping the family structure again and again, never letting anything settle. Accounts describe strain with both parents, Orson consumed by his own filmmaking obsessions, Rita's personal difficulties making any real stability nearly impossible to maintain. But here's the twist: Rita's younger daughter, Yasmin Aga Khan, had an entirely different experience. As her mother's Alzheimer's progressed, Yasmin became deeply, personally involved in caring for her, staying close when it would have been easy to stay away. That contrast matters enormously. Rita wasn't some hidden villain lurking beneath the glamour. She was a wounded woman whose illness, relationships, and fame combined to create distance her children simply had to survive, each in her own way. The screen preserved her as effortlessly perfect, dazzling, untouchable. Her daughters knew the truth, that every sparkling entrance on camera concealed a private life that could shift direction without warning, and without much say from the people living inside it. Number 9. Joan Fontaine. The feud nobody saw coming, because everyone was watching a different one. Everyone remembers Joan Fontaine for her decades-long, headline-grabbing feud with her sister, Olivia de Havilland. Far fewer people know that Fontaine's relationships with her own daughters quietly fell apart too, with almost none of the public attention. Both of Fontaine's daughters became estranged from her, at different points in her life, leaving the actress increasingly isolated from the very family she'd worked to build. Her first daughter, Deborah, was born during Fontaine's marriage to William Dozier. Years later, Fontaine adopted a Peruvian girl named Martita, publicly framed at the time as a generous new beginning for the family. According to biographical accounts, that relationship reportedly deteriorated once Martita reached adulthood. Here's where the story gets genuinely murky. The exact reasons behind these breaks remain contested to this day, and Fontaine's well-documented instinct for tightly controlling her own public image makes it extremely difficult for anyone to reconstruct what actually happened. What's left is simply the outline: a woman who spent decades locked in a very public war with her sister, and who later lost closeness with her own children too, with barely anyone outside the family ever noticing. Maybe Fontaine feared betrayal after everything she'd been through. Maybe her daughters felt managed rather than genuinely loved. Nobody outside that family circle really knows. What is clear is that silence became a pattern. One of Hollywood's most elegant, celebrated actresses watched her closest bonds quietly dissolve into distance, then let pride turn that distance permanent. Next, a director so consumed by unfinished films and constant motion that his own daughter described him less like a father, and more like an occasional, magnetic visitor in her life. Number 10. Orson Welles. The magnetic visitor who never quite became Dad. Growing up as Orson Welles' daughter meant sharing him, with unfinished films, international productions, financial emergencies, political battles, and a public that treated him like a fallen king who might still stage a comeback. His eldest daughter, Christopher, later described their relationship in a specific, almost haunting way, shaped less by daily parenting, and more by occasional appearances from someone dazzling who happened to drop by. When Welles was actually present, he could be charming, generous, funny, genuinely unforgettable. The problem was how rarely present ever turned into routine. He traveled constantly, and lived almost entirely inside creative projects that swallowed his money, energy, and time whole. His children frequently learned about changes in his life secondhand, through other adults, or through newspaper coverage, rather than from him directly. A brief visit could feel thrilling in the moment. It also served as a constant reminder of exactly how temporary his attention really was. Later memoirs and interviews reveal something more complicated than simple resentment, though. His daughters kept searching for real emotional connection, well into adulthood. Their memories aren't filled only with anger. Love remains stubbornly present, which somehow makes the absence hurt more, not less. A child who feels nothing for a parent can eventually stop waiting. A child who genuinely adores an unpredictable one might keep waiting forever. It's worth noting the parallel to his career. Wells spent his whole life fighting to control his art, and mostly losing. Studios cut his films, investors pulled out, projects dissolved before completion. His family relationships developed that exact same unfinished quality. He didn't leave behind a simple story of rejection. Number 11, John Huston, the director who couldn't direct his own family. Inside John Huston's world, life was engineered to feel exactly like one of his films: dangerous, artistic, unpredictable, packed wall to wall with extraordinary people passing through. For his children, especially Angelica and her brother Tony, all that excitement came bundled with something much lonelier. Angelica Huston later described growing up in rural Ireland while her father traveled constantly, directing films, chasing relationships, hunting, gambling, and steadily building his legend as the fearless Hollywood adventurer. She and her brother lived surrounded by genuine beauty. But beauty, it turns out, doesn't stop a child from feeling left behind. Things got even more complicated when Angelica entered acting through her father's film, A Walk with Love and Death. Their existing personal tension followed them straight onto the film set. She was still a teenager, uncertain about the role, and Huston didn't respond like a protective father. He responded like a demanding director, growing visibly impatient whenever she failed to meet his professional standards. That put Angelica in an almost impossible position. She needed professional approval from the exact same man whose personal approval had always felt maddeningly out of reach. Here's the part that complicates any simple judgment of Huston, though: their relationship genuinely improved with time. Years later, Angelica won an Academy Award for Prizzi's Honor, directed by her own father, creating one of Hollywood's proudest father-daughter collaborations on record. It's a real, earned triumph. But that happy ending shouldn't erase the earlier cost. John gave his children culture, incredible stories, famous houseguests, remarkable opportunities most kids could never dream of. What he didn't reliably give them was ordinary availability. He could locate emotional weakness in an actor's performance within seconds. Number 12, W.C. Fields. Was the joke ever really just a joke? Long before audiences knew anything about his actual family, W.C. Fields had already built his entire comic identity around one running joke: impatience, even outright disdain, for children. His sarcastic lines about kids became so famous, so relentlessly repeated, that a lot of people simply assumed the performer and the character were the exact same man underneath. The truth was messier than the punchline. Fields had a real son, William Jr., with his wife Harriet Hughes. The marriage collapsed, and father and son spent long stretches of their lives apart. Family accounts describe bitterness, legal tension, and contact that stayed tightly restricted for years. Fields did keep sending financial support throughout, but money, as plenty of families on this list have already shown us, can't manufacture ordinary memories or rebuild daily trust once it's gone. Here's the part that really gets you. William Jr. grew up hearing total strangers repeat his own father's jokes about hating children. Jokes that, to everyone else, were just harmless comedy. To him, they landed very differently. The man behind them stayed distant enough, long enough, that the legend started to feel entirely believable, even inside his own family. Biographers still don't agree on what was actually happening beneath the surface. Some argue Fields genuinely wanted more of a relationship with his son than he ever got. Others believe his career, his habits, and his own demons always came first, every single time a choice had to be made. Either way, the son was left holding a famous surname and a question he could never fully answer: was his father's cruelty toward children just a stage act, or was it, underneath everything, the one honest thing the man ever performed?